Hello fellow readers, welcome to the channel The Star is the Book. What is the greatest international concern these days? Or at least the greatest international concern to my poor senses? The Russian-Ukrainian war. So to try and understand the undercurrents behind it, I've recruited the help of Andrey Kurkov, who is widely considered to be the greatest Ukrainian living author. He wrote this book, Grey Bees. Grey Bees, to me the title refers to how nature can be weaponized and put to the service of war. Sergei Sergeyevich is the main character of this book, and he's a beekeeper, a solitary occupation in itself, all the more solitary because he performs it in the Donbass, in the gray zone, a sort of no man's land right there in the middle between the Russian separatists on one side and the Ukrainian army on the other. There's occasional shelling and fighting, which renders life hard for Sergei and the other inhabitant in his village. Yep, there's only two inhabitants in this village, Sergei and his frenemy, Pashka. They have a relationship of brotherly dislike ever since they were kids. This probably serves as a mirror of the belligerent sociological nature of the region. Pashka is closer to the separatists, whereas Sergei has Ukrainian leanings. In a moment of boredom and rebellion, Sergei even decides to change the names of the street in his village, because Pashka, who you remember as separatist affinities, used to live in Taras Shevchenko Street, and Taras Shevchenko is the national poet of Ukraine, a man who was persecuted by the Tsarist regime in the 19th century. On the other side, Sergei, who has Ukrainian leanings, used to live in Lenin Street. So the fact that he changes the signs of the streets gives each and every one of them a much more coherent geography, and it shows that history in this part of the world seems to be interchangeable with a sense of belonging that can simultaneously be Russian and Ukrainian. Yep, you can have two things. Even Kurkov's career as a writer is a fine example of that, since prior to the invasion he took immense pride in writing in Russian. History is a never-ending battle for political and identitary meaning. Sergei is estranged from his ex-wife and daughter, and as he recollects their relationship, we find a very important feature of Sergei, and more broadly of the specific geography of where he lives. They became estranged because, in his opinion, his wife just enjoyed standing out. And by standing out, I just mean enjoying using bright colors in public or choosing a less Slavic name to their daughter. This, to me, is a focal point of the book, and something that Kurkov even alludes to in several of his interviews. Over there in the Donbass, the memory of the USSR and Stalinist persecution shaped indelibly the idiosyncrasy. Gray is the predominant color. Standing out is dangerous. Painting your fence with bright colors completely anathema, and even something as smiling in public is frowned upon. On the other side, Kurkov defends that as a whole Ukrainian culture is much more Western orientated, and if it wasn't the case, probably then the invasion settled the disputes. Listen to this on page 8, a foreword written by the author himself to his work. Organized anarchy has been the matrix of the Ukrainian mentality. Ukrainians are individualists. While Russians generally have the same image of one great Russia in their imaginations, each Ukrainian has his or her own Ukraine in which they would like to live. Sergei is extremely concerned with his beehives. Spring is approaching and shelling won't help his bees feed, so he decides to travel over to the Crimea in his beat-up plaza, with a few stops in the middle, to reunite with an old beekeeper friend of his, a Tatar Muslim. This attempt at a reunion in the Crimea is to me the strongest and most gut-wrenching part of the book. Even though it starts funny, there's a funny attempt at an interview by Russian media on his arrival to a Crimean checkpoint in his beat-up Lada, but Sergei is too naive and he mentions the word shelling too many often, so the interview is botched. Over there, in the Crimea, he witnesses the edifying features of Russian rule. His friend, his beekeeper friend, has been killed by a Russian militia, and under false pretext they even arrest the man's son to force him to enlist the war. And then in society is always the least assimilated ones that bear most of the burden of fighting. In America, for instance, in there was also a disproportionate amount of black soldiers. The locals in the Crimea seem to have been so lobotomized by propaganda that they even dispute Tatar influence and Tatar history in the peninsula, because in one very sinister quote from one of the characters, what happened is what Putin say happened. Putin never lies. This reflects what I found to be the most striking and bewildering aspect of this war. Propaganda can be so brilliantly executed that human nature is so instrumentalized and weaponized, and a society can be rendered absolutely inhumane that they even discuss on prime-time television starting a nuclear war. There's also a very striking example of that in the book, as the FSB, the Russian intelligence, replaces the bees in one of Sergei Sergeyevich's beehives with grey ones. Imagine a full-scale biological war using bees. As the style is concerned, well, I found it to be quite dry, the pace a bit boring. There's endless nightmares and dreams of Sergei Sergeyevich, and I personally dislike dreams as plot accelerators, and I had a very hard time gathering enough interest to try and find out what happens to Sergei in the end. The book, to me, is worth much more for the sociological aspects of it than by its own literary merits. But to each its own. So, that's a wrap. Hope you kind folks enjoy. Hope to see you again for a next review. And until then, please support Ukraine in any way, shape or form you can. Their fight is a good fight. God bless the Ukrainians. Long live President Zelensky. Slava Ukraini.